So welcome very much to Stories of Eco-Gastronomy. My name is David Szanto. I am a professor at the University of Gastronomic Sciences in Pollenzo, the university, as you probably know, that was co-founded by Slow Food International about 11 years ago now. And I was a master myself in 2005-2006 in the program at the university. Now I'm a teacher and I am organizing this project, the Eco-Gastronomy project. But 10 years ago, I was also standing in front of a group of people at Terra Madre, Salone del Gusto, talking about some research I was doing then about farmers markets in the world, and talking about the different points of connection that farmers markets make real for people when they come to buy food. They connect with the producer, they connect with food, they connect with place, and together those connections start to create a kind of system, a system of food. So, 10 years later, here I am again, talking about different connections, different people and places and food and systems of food. And what I'd like to do today is share some of these stories and particularly ask you what they evoke for you in terms of your own experiences with food systems, with people and places and food. Because this project is an experiment. It's an experiment that we've been running for about a year, and it's now time to check in on the results of that experiment and see how the experiment should change, see whether the experiment has been successful, whether the experiment is producing interesting results, and if it isn't, or if it could produce more interesting results, how we can do that together. One of the origins of this project actually came about probably about 2 years ago in Bra. I was sitting with Barney Houghton, who is another professor at the university who lives in Bristol in England. And he runs a foundation about cooking and eating and living better. And Barney and I were trying to figure out, if there is such a thing to do, why the University of Gastronomic Sciences seems to be such a transformational place. Because over the years, over the 10 years that he and I have both taught there, we've seen in the students something very extraordinary happen. They come to our university and they study. And they taste, and they eat, they think and they feel about food. They've come to the university because they feel very strongly about food in the first place. They cook together. They socialize together. They travel. They sit in very cold classrooms that are sometimes very hot, depending on the time of year. They learn to feel and think and do with food through their whole body. And it also recognizes that the mind and the body aren't separate, and that the gut and the soul are not separate, and that all of these things participate when we study food, when we do anything with food, in fact. So, what Barney and I were talking about was how to take that transformational, full-body knowledge experience of food and do that in other places. Because, of course, we have many students who come to Pollenzo, but what about all the people in the world that we might like to share this experience with and perhaps also help create some transformation in other places, not just in the students who pass through our doors. So far, I've been to 12 different countries, working with local partners in each of those places to organize events. And sometimes they're formal lectures, sometimes they're informal stories, sometimes they're roundtables, tastings, dinners, casual encounters, all sorts of different things. But it depends on the local place. And in each of those places, the eco-gastronomy of it is to think, feel, and do something with food. And I'll give some examples of that later. But that thinking, doing, feeling, that's what gastronomy is, and that's what eco-gastronomy is when you do it with a larger community of people and places and food. And that's what this project has become. We call it an international initiative to create an exchange of knowledge around the world about food and food systems. That's the formal description. What happens is people come together, share experience, learn stuff, and then continue to share it on and on. That's the reality of what food is for most people, is a very immersive, multidimensional process. So we're trying to activate that around a conversation that's about ecology, it's about philosophy, And it's also about discovering what can happen when we don't really know where we're going. So Albert Einstein is credited having said, if we knew where we were going, it wouldn't be called research. And it's a nice idea, because a lot of research is often very based on a hypothesis, testing the hypothesis, proving the hypothesis, and then coming to firm conclusions. And that's one process of doing research, but it also kind of already assumes what might happen. This experiment, we don't know quite what will happen. We hope, mostly, that we will produce value in the world for the different people who are participating in the project. So value for the people who come to the events. New knowledge, new experience, new personal connections, new ideas about food, new solutions for their own situations. Value for the local partners, so value for the projects that have already been successful doing gastronomy around the world. And valuable for me, I'm learning an enormous amount, but also valuable for the university. We're spreading this idea about gastronomy around the world, and hopefully, maybe some people will come back to us and study with us at some point. So creating value is a very kind of abstract objective. It's not a hypothesis. It's an idea about how to make the world better when it comes to food. The other part about creating value, and I'll explain that in some of the stories, is that it's often not obvious what that means to people. So I've gone to places, and I start talking to a local partner, and one of them will say, all right, well, just tell me what your budget is, and I'll tell you what I can give you. And I say, well, actually, if you're not going to get anything out of it other than money, maybe I'll go talk to someone else, because this project isn't about an exchange of money for services. This is a project about creating value, about everybody putting value in and everybody getting value out. Because when money comes into it, of course, someone starts saying, well, I don't think I'm getting my money's worth. And that gets a little bit complicated when we're talking about experimentation with value. So money has always been an interesting question in this planet, and it continues to be an interesting and very complicating question for this project. So I'm going to set up a few questions for you, and then I'll get into the stories. The first question for you, as I describe what's happened over the last 10 months, because I've traveled to all these places, I've met some extraordinary people, they've created knowledge, they've shared it with their communities, I'm sharing it with this community, I've been writing reports, there's been a lot of different ways that knowledge is moving around. But how can we decentralize that knowledge making, that experience even more? That's one question for you. Another question is, how? What format should that knowledge be in? I've written some things, I've taken videos and made photographs. People have embodied the knowledge by coming to the events. But in what other ways can food knowledge exist? That's question number 2. And then there's this ethos, the ethical question of the project. How can we continue to create value about eco-gastronomy while money is always going to be present, while we try to expand the project, while we try to make it more diffuse around the world? But how can we maintain the ethos of creating value with all of the realities of the world in which we live? So there's a great anthropologist. Sadly, he died about 10 years ago, but he was one of the very interesting anthropologists who recognized some of the challenges inherent to what anthropologists do. Anthropologists over the years have recognized that when they tell about culture, they're actually also constructing that culture through their words. They are writing culture, as some of them have called it. So this one, Dwight Conquergood, talked about the importance of telling stories. Because he said, he actually quotes another sociologist who says, what the map cuts up, the story cuts across. And if you think of what a map is, very often it's lines on a piece of paper that divides things. It divides one country from another. It divides land from water. It divides past from present. It divides streets into grids. So maps define and frame and construct boundaries. What do stories do? Stories dissolve those boundaries. Stories cross over them, go in and out of them, and often put power in the voice or in the body of the person telling the story. The map puts power in the political organization that created the map. It's a document, it's formal. The story is informal, it's live, it's in real time. And it's about me creating something for you. So the map and the story has been a theme for me. There's one other food scholar, she's a philosopher who's been very inspiring to me, a woman named Lisa Helke. And she talks about the importance of differentiating between truth and certainty. Where certainty is a bit like a map. It's defined, it's agreed upon, it's something that everybody understands. Truth is much more personal sometimes. Now you could also say that truth is one of those absolutes in the world that exists because people write it down. But a truth might also just be something that I hold to be very strongly real for me. And so thinking about the stories that I'm about to tell, I will warn you that they are stories, and they are my truths, but they are by no means certainties about what happened, nor certainties about what is. So, the international knowledge exchange about food and food systems began in Expo Milano in September of last year in some ways, where I traveled around, and I met some former students. I met a lot of different people telling their stories about food in a quite formal way. This is just one panorama I took. It took me an hour and 15 minutes to get in the front gate the day I went there. And there was something over 250,000 people there. And the pavilions are all telling stories. And the pavilions are talking about feeding 9 billion people. And the people who work in the pavilions are telling their individual stories of how they came to work there and what their story is about food. And so the stories started flowing even at this very formal event, even at this very official international exchange of knowledge about food. And it started planting some seeds for me about what is true, what is certain, who's got the official story, who gets to decide what stories about food to tell. And from there, I went on to Seoul in South Korea. And in South Korea, the very first thing I learned when I got onto the bus transfer from the airport to our hotel was that in Korea, food equals medicine. And for someone who comes from a fairly cultural approach to food, food equals medicine seemed very specific and very, well, a little hard for me to swallow, a little hard for me to feel good about. But I was trying to be open and trying to think, okay, where can this lead me? So as we traveled throughout mostly Seoul, I was very much in the city of Seoul and the city of Goyang, which is almost not separated from Seoul. It's a massive metropolis of about 30 million people. I was part of a series of different events, and I kept having in my mind this question, is food medicine? Am I food? Am I medicine? Because I think of food and humans as very connected. It started to make me wonder about the connection between humans and medicine. And so we did a number of things. We were treated wonderfully by the organization that had set up this event. We went to a royal banquet, eating on the left here were something like 17 different kinds of mushrooms. I come from North America, and in my home places I have about 8 kinds of mushrooms. I'd never seen some of these things, certainly never tasted them. The textures were extraordinary, the aromas were wonderful. And then a small amount of meat, of course, many different kinds of kimchi. In Korea, the practice of fermenting vegetables, particularly in the late autumn months, particularly things like cabbage and root vegetables, is a practice about preserving freshness, because fermented vegetables maintain their crispness, their texture. The flavor lasts long into the winter. So it's a way of not only having the nutritional benefit of the foods further into the winter, but also having that sense of eating fresh vegetables, even though they've been preserved through fermentation. So we had this beautiful meal, and we had tea, and we had a little bit of shochu, but not too much. It was a nice, balanced meal. And towards the end of it, the cooks brought out women's rice and men's rice. And again, for a North American, basically pro-feminist, man of the 2000s, I was thinking women's rice and men's rice? That's an interesting separation. I wonder what it means. And one rice was meant to cool down the passions, and one rice was meant to warm up the passions. And I won't tell you which one, but you can use your own particular prejudices and beliefs about what men are and what women are and what rice is and what Korea is to decide who got what kind of rice. I ate a little bit of both just to see what would happen. But one of the amazing things in this restaurant that we went to was very focused on this idea of food equals medicine. And so we went upstairs, and in the upstairs part of the restaurant, which was also some seating areas, they had hundreds of these containers, these glass containers, filled with various liquids. I'm assuming some of them were water-based and some of them were alcohol-based. And they were infusing different medicinal plants and roots and herbs, and they were drying things in bags. And I was stunned by the incredible preparation and attention that was being given to the ingredients that we had just eaten. So I started wondering, well, maybe I shouldn't have mixed that women's rice and men's rice. Maybe I'm doing something bizarre in terms of combining medicines. I don't know. But other things happened to me as well. At the expo where we were basically housed, I met this man who was a curator of an exhibition of ongi. Ongi are these large ceramic vessels that sitting in front of him, and they're fermentation vessels. And they have various different forms for different purposes. Historically, they were used to ferment vegetables and grains and all sorts of things, but also human excrement as a way to advance the process of turning excrement into fertilizer. And so these vessels are fascinating because they have this incredible history. The more complex ones were used for the royal court. The more simple ones were used by farmers and peasants. And so the techniques and the textures of the material of this very simple clay pot became also part of the idea of practicing medicine and practicing it maybe in different ways for different communities. We also met a rice farmer. This man who calls his rice farm Wubo, which has two translations he told us about. One was cow step, so like the step of a cow, and one was silly walk, which you might also associate it with the step of a cow. And he calls it silly walk because he thinks of himself as a bit of an outcast from farming society. The other farmers make fun of him because he's obsessed with saving seeds. And he saved seeds of different varieties indigenous to Korea and not, hundreds and hundreds of them in his space. And he's also growing some of them. And last year he planted 16 different varieties of rice, which in Korea right now is quite unusual. A lot of the rice is imported from outside and not always of very high quality. He's growing very high quality rice, but also incredible varieties of it. And he put them all 16 varieties into a rice cooker for the same amount of time, with the same amount of water, with the same heat, as an experiment to see what would happen. Didn't taste like any rice that I'd ever had, but you could see there were about 8 different colors. And the taste was an extraordinary blend of stuff. Not the women's rice and the men's rice from before, but something else. And he's just trying stuff out because he's worried about not enough experimentation, not enough diversity taking place in Korean food right now. And then on my last day, I went with my friend and former student Sam Park to what's called Pigfoot Alley. It's not actually an alleyway in Seoul. It's a short stretch of an urban street where there are about 6 restaurants that sell pig's feet, pig's trotters, the bottom part of the leg, along with different kinds of kimchis and pickled vegetables and chilies and garlic and, of course, some good, very bland Korean beer. And that was our last meal, and we ate it with hot sauce and it was delicious. And then I got in a plane for 26 hours. And I felt really good. One of the things that happened to me in Korea, which I've never experienced as strongly, and I was only there for a week, was that I sensed the smell of my body much more strongly than usual. And it was very pleasant and reassuring and constantly there. For a while I thought I was smelling food because it smelled of, fermentation and mushrooms and earth and moss. And I asked myself, is this food I'm smelling? And I started smelling myself, and it was me. And I don't know whether this was the food equals medicine idea in my head, whether it was the men's and women's rice, whether it was all the kimchi I was eating, or the miso soup, or the green tea, or the presence with people who are paying attention to food in this way, I felt comforted. I felt a kind of presence. And the presence was my smell. And I thought, what would happen? What would happen if, instead of doing an ethnography of a place by writing words down on paper, what would happen if we did an ethnography based in smell or based in touch? What could be done with anthropology that used the other senses, not just the eyes and the hands to write the words down, but all those other senses that we humans are possessed with? And how comforting might it be to smell an ethnography of a place, or an ethnography of yourself, when life was too stressful, when your food was not medicinal enough? I came to have a very different understanding of what food equals medicine might be. Other things happened. Went to Mexico City. Mexico City is a fascinating place. Crazy, chaotic, more traffic than I'd ever seen. I was there just before the Festival of the Virgin on the 15th of December. It was horrible in terms of traffic. It was beautiful in terms of scenery. What had we done? We decided to organize an event around entrepreneurship, ethics, and food. Jose Carlos Rodon is an alumni of the University of Gastronomic Sciences. He now has a business in Mexico City about food. He has a small shop, he has a food truck, and a farm. And as I was talking to him and thinking, what could we do in your city that would be interesting for you, that would be interesting for the community, he said, you know what's been really difficult about starting this food business? I haven't paid any bribes. I decided when I started this, I was not going to participate in that system of business. And that system of business in Mexico City is the dominant system of business. That is how most people do business. The administrators move your paperwork through the system faster with a little bit of extra cash. The suppliers bring your food on the day that they commit to bring your food, if you participate in that additional payment. And he had a very difficult time talking about this. As many places, it is often shameful or difficult to talk about what you know is not right about your society. But Jose Carlos said, I think we should talk about this. I think we should have a public event about the issues of corruption and ethics and entrepreneurship and food. And if we're going to talk about eco-gastronomy and doing food better, let's talk about this particular issue. Well, it's a pretty heavy subject. And indeed, it was a difficult and emotional conversation to have. We had experts from different sectors of food in Mexico City, including the world of hotel and restaurants, including the world of slow food, including the world of small business. And we had a very powerful conversation. But we also had a Christmas party. We also decided if we're going to have this difficult conversation, we're going to have some fun too. And we have to eat, because this is thinking, doing, and eating food. That's what gastronomy is. And so we did that. And at the end of the evening, a new colleague from the University of, one of the universities in Mexico, the National Autonomous University of Mexico, came to me and said, David, I'm getting a ride home with Claudia and Stefan. This is amazing. I said, I'm glad you're getting a ride home, but why is that amazing? I said, David, this is Mexico City. We don't go home with strangers. I would never get into a car with someone I didn't know. But something happened tonight, and I don't know what it was, but I feel like I trust them. Something happened here. I don't know what it is. That was one data point from this event, that this woman told me she trusts strangers. Something happened in the conversation, in the ponche, in the tamales, in the dancing, and the singing, and the destruction of this beautiful piñata. We had some very powerful connections that happened. And I thought, if that can happen in this little event, what else can food inspire? The street food of Mexico is, of course, extraordinary. If you've ever been to Mexico City, the tortas trucks and the tacos and all of the food that's being cooked constantly on the street outside is absolutely magnificent to witness. There are other very innovative new things happening too. So this woman, an extraordinary spirit who is working with her brother on a project called Lacto Graphene. And they are cheesemongers. They help people produce cheese. They help people sell cheese. They have a wholesale business. They have a retail business. And Geo is the living spirit behind this project. So she calls smelling her true self. Smelling cheese is when she feels like she's embodying the world. And she's working particularly with women from the countryside to help them redevelop ancestral recipes of cheese and help them commercialize those products. But she also told me that one of the things that she does that's most important for those women is she listens to them. Because as rural women, they don't have a lot of community listening to them. Their husbands are often busy or not paying attention in the ways that they would like. And so Geo has become a kind of therapist, psychologist, listener. And it's as much by listening to them and hearing their stories as by selling their cheese that she's helping them to become more powerful, more independent, more confident. And so this is another success story that I just happened to witness, but it was a very powerful one for me. So time ticks by, and in February of this year, I went to Singapore. Singapore, where I had a colleague who works in food and performance. We thought, let's organize a week related to the performances of food around Chinese New Year's. Chinese New Year's is, of course, a very big and important holiday, sometimes called Lunar New Year if you're not in China. And it's about celebrating the return of many things. So one of the returns is the return of family. People come back together again at Chinese New Year's. There's a homecoming meal on the first night. And then for the subsequent nights and days, you go and visit your family and your relations and your friends. In order of authority and seniority, you start with the most important, the grandmother, both grandmothers. And then it trickles down to the aunts, uncles, cousins, and later on your best friend. And so I participated in Chinese New Year's with Carmen. I became an unofficial member of the Wong family very briefly. And I also got to witness what happens in Singapore, which is also a very extraordinary place in terms of food. Very unusual for me because so much of food in Singapore is eaten outside of the home. Kitchens in most apartments are quite small. There's often, even among the not super wealthy class, there's often a domestic worker. So there's already some interesting stratification of classes within the household. But then an enormous amount of food is eaten at hawker centers, at these large food courts with many different types of food from many different countries. Singapore is certainly a very large mosaic of different cuisines. Very inexpensive. It's subsidized by the government. It helps get people into the street. It helps get good food into the people. The tastes are certainly amazing, but I personally was quite uncomfortable with it because I just wanted to cook for myself. And I went to a supermarket, and I'll show you an image from the supermarket, and it was quite difficult to buy relatively inexpensive, simple food at the supermarket in the neighborhood that I was staying in because I just didn't know how to find it properly. I should have gone to a wet market and bought fruits and vegetables and meat there. I didn't know how to do that, so I didn't. But as an outsider, Singapore didn't immediately welcome me in the same way that perhaps Mexico did. One of the first things that we did was to go and have the famous Singapore chicken rice. And at a certain moment, about 3 years ago, I had a student in my course from Singapore, and I said, write a short story about some of your favorite food. And he wrote about Singapore chicken rice. And I have to say, it wasn't a very interesting story, because he just said, it's so good. And so at a certain moment in the class, I said, I read your short piece, and I was interested. What was so good about the chicken rice? Why do you miss it so much? What is it about Singapore chicken rice that is exciting to you? He said, well, it's the flavor. I said, okay, we're in a writing course. I need another word. Which flavor? I think it's in the rice. Okay, well, what about the rice? Well, it's just the way it tastes. Okay, how else do you eat it? Well, there's chicken and sauce. All right. He could not express in words what was so special to him about Singapore chicken rice. So I was very excited to sit down and try it myself. And so there's the chicken, very simply cooked. boiled. You see it's not browned. It doesn't have a beautiful crispy skin. The pieces of meat are chopped up. There's a very international spicy chili sauce that goes with it. There's some other condiments. There's a less sweet chili sauce. There's soy sauce. And there's the rice, which is often cooked with a certain amount of chicken fat. And I ate it, and I was like, oh, this is really good. Oh. Okay, it's the flavor. Oh, it's, and I found out, apparently, for me too, there is no way to describe the amazing taste of Singapore chicken rice in words. It just is good. So, as a longtime writing teacher, I took a lesson from my student that some things maybe shouldn't be put into words. So in the supermarkets where I tried to go then make some food for myself, I found this particular wine, Tavernello. Who here is Italian? All right, so a few of you may have seen Tavernello in your local, not enoteca or wine shop, but Hyper Co-op, right? Because Tavernello sells for €1 for a liter in Italy. And here in Singapore, $21, about the equivalent of $18, 18 euros. And it's listed, it's shown, it's the #1 wine in Italy, it says on the label. Well, it's certainly used for cooking a lot, and sometimes for being made into vinegar, and sometimes for cleaning the floor. I would not necessarily say that it's the most aromatic or complex of wines that I've ever had. But I was fascinated to see it on sale as a special wine in Singapore, in the grocery store, as a kind of classic Italian wine. And it made me understand also once again, how important context is, naming, packaging, and also when things get moved from their place of origin, they become a different thing. I thought about myself, having been moved from my place of origin in Montreal to Singapore, and becoming different because my context was different, and becoming perhaps more valuable, less valuable, but also not quite fitting in the same way that I knew myself at home. So the Tavernello, in some ways, made me see myself again because of this different place I was in Singapore. I also went to a 7-Eleven. 7-Eleven is a large convenience store chain from the United States, which is now spread across the world. And in the 7-Elevens in the United States, they're often at gas stations. They are often considered to be places of very low quality food. And in Singapore, there are a lot of 7-Elevens, and there was one near the place I was staying, and I didn't have any food one night, and I stopped in, and I found these, which are Japanese soft-boiled eggs preserved in sweet soy sauce. And I thought, well, I can't not buy a soft-boiled egg from a 7-Eleven in Singapore, because that's a great story. And if you can see on the package, it says in English, in yellow, "I'm fragile, please don't squeeze me." So already the packaging was communicating with me in a kind of cute, cartoonish way. And I wanted to buy this thing, and I wanted to eat it, and I wanted to see what it was like to eat a Singapore Japanese soft-boiled egg in sweet soy sauce. And it was kind of good. I had a good time with that. Another minor indication of the complex foodscape of Singapore, I went to a hawker center, and this Wurstelstand was, as they named themselves, the last sausage kiosk before the equator. Very typical Singaporean food, I think. German sausages close to the equator. This is part of Singapore. So as I said, part of the purpose we were in Singapore to organize some performance workshops with a number of different communities, one of which was an arts college called LaSalle College of the Arts. Very well-reputed school, and we were doing what we call the tactile storytelling and performance workshop with these students, helping them to feel the world around them through more of their senses than just the visual, which is, of course, the ones that most of us have been trained to use very well, but to hear, to smell, to touch, to feel, and also to think about maybe how those senses combine. There's a property called synesthesia in some people, where people smell colors or see sounds. And this idea of senses coming together, it may seem almost magical, but maybe it's actually a lot more realistic than dividing them into 5 or 8 senses. Don't we actually experience the world in a holistic way? So this was the question we were posing to our students. How can you tell a story about food through more senses than just the visual? What can you do? We challenged them to do this. We gave them a workshop for 2 days, and then they held a showcase. And these are just some of the images. These two women were talking about the environmental degradation that we've committed in the world and the way that it's polluting the places where we make our food. A very simple story. We know it all very well. But what they did was they simultaneously dirtied rice, in this case with some black ink. The woman on the left was covering pieces of rice with black ink and then handing it to the woman on the right, who was standing in a bucket filled with clean water. And she would bring the rice into the bucket and clean it and then spread it out again into the world. And so these cycles of dirtying and cleaning with the symbolic, very symbolic food of rice were for them a way to tell the story about what we do with food and our environment and our own bodies and how it's all, in fact, one system. This other woman from, where was she now? Forget, a Scandinavian country, studying in Singapore, decided she wanted to create a vast tableau with food. And she was intense, and for 4 hours she just constructed this magnificent tabletop full of pieces of rice and bread and cakes and milk and melons and fruits. And the whole thing afterwards was a beautiful landscape of food. And it didn't tell a story so much about a place as a story about her process. It was like it was a painting of a cook's dance through a kitchen. And as we watched her do it, we saw she was deeply immersed in this experience. She had become one with her own food. And afterwards, then we saw her, and we saw the landscape, and they were two things, but they were also from the same place. And Chonghua here told a story about her father, and memory, and eating cookies, and the pain that she feels from his death. And it was very, very non-explicit, but as I sat and watched this woman who had just gone through a very intense 48-hour workshop, and she communicated so much with the act of eating a piece of paper with her father's name written on it. And I thought, I don't know, but I know. I haven't heard her words, but I've sensed so strongly her connection between herself, her father, language, and these cookies, this tin that she had with cookies in it. And so again, this was non-specific. We didn't know where we were going, but she got somewhere, and she made quite a number of us cry just watching the intensity with which she felt the presence of her father and the cookies. While I was there in Singapore, I made a quick side trip to Timor-Leste. What? Well, just so happened when I was in Korea, standing in the hotel lobby, I ran into one of the coordinators of the Dili Slow Food Convivium, an incredible woman named Alva Lim. And she was living in Dili, and she had come to Korea for this festival, and she said to me, "Hey, David, while you're in Singapore, why don't you come to Timor? There are direct flights." And I was like, "Sure, that's great." Didn't look up that the flights were $800. They go only 3 times a week. It's 3,500 kilometers away. And no, I'd forgotten to bring any insect repellent with me to Singapore, let alone to Dili, where there are about 16 different kinds of mosquito-borne viruses. Sure, I'm on my way. So as a complete naive, I packed up my bag for 3 days and I went to Dili and had one of the most transformative experiences I've ever had in food. Timor, as many of us know, is a place that has been completely ravaged by war, occupation, invasion, colonization over the last 400 years. It was colonized by the Portuguese, and then over the last century has been invaded by the Americans and the Japanese, has been occupied by the Indonesians, has now declared independence, and is coming into a relative period of stability. But for all that time, incredible damage was done to the culture, families were torn apart, and many people suffered enormous pain. It's also one of the most agro-biodiverse places in the world. If you know the Indonesian archipelago, it moves from the west down this way towards the east, and then Australia is here. And so it's at a crossing point between Asia and Oceania. And the food is unbelievable in terms of what grows and is produced and is still eaten. Of course, multinationals are moving in, and the number one food there is cup noodles. They call it super meat. So wheat is becoming the dominant grain. But historically, before that it was rice, and before that it was corn, and there was also sorghum on the island. There are 3 different kinds of passion fruit. There are 8 different kinds of avocados. The list goes on and on. It produces amazing things in terms of spices, turmeric, ginger. There are 45 different distinct dialects spoken just in East Timor, in Timor-Leste. This is a population of 1 million people with 45 languages. Many of the mountain villages are quite remote and don't have a lot of sharing or communication. So the languages have remained intact, and of course so has the food, because food and language always parallel each other. What's happened? They're rediscovering the joy, the deliciousness, the pride, and the sense of identity as Timorese that their food is giving them. And certainly, Alva and her collaborators on the slow food team have done a great deal to help this happen. This is the Taibesi market. It's one of the biggest markets I've ever been to in my entire life, and I've been to some pretty big markets. I bet it beats out Porto Palazzo. It's huge. And it goes on and on and on, and you just see the diversity as you walk through. This is just some of the foods that are sold. There are many different kinds of beans and legumes. The cracked corn, which is one of the staples of the classic Timorese diet. Alva herself discovered these. I don't know what they are, but she was really excited to see them. It might be turmeric of some sort of variety. And she said, look, I found it. And then she was off finding something else, and I have no idea what it was. We were taken there by a man named Ego Lemos, who's here at Terra Madre right now, and if you've ever wanted to meet one of the most extraordinary food activists in the world, go find Ego Lemos somewhere in this community of 5,000. Ego is a superstar of music in Timor. Huge celebrity, knows everyone. Everyone knows him. It was slow walking through this market with him. And his songs are very often about pride in Timorese food. And he's organized an NGO called Permatil, which is about teaching kids about permaculture. And he's working with the Ministry of Education of Timor to insert an incredible curriculum about Timorese food into the elementary school program so that every Timorese child learns about his own food, her own food, as they grow up in this new era of relative peace. And he's just a really, really cool and charismatic guy. So he's an idea for me about how music, activism, policy, and fun can all go together to create some truly inspiring change in food. But so's Alva. She decided one day, you know what, I'm interested in fermenting. There's not a lot of interesting vinegar here. There's a lot of imported vinegar from Europe. I'm going to make my own vinegar. So she went and harvested some coffee cherries, got a vinegar mother, soaked it all together, did a little bit of fermenting, and now she's making this bizarre coffee-infused, coffee cherry, the fruit, infused in the vinegar, and I tasted it. It wasn't quite ripe yet, but it was pretty fascinating. And she's now started her own food lab in Dili to continue these kinds of projects. One of the remarkable outcomes of their work there that I wanted to share with you, because I think it's a brilliant project for any place, is that they created a food map of Timor-Leste entirely made out of the food of the places that grow in those different locations. So this is a close-up, and you can see that they've glued, like some sort of elementary school project, they've glued beans and nuts and tomatoes and potatoes and different plants of different varieties to represent where those foods grow in Timor-Leste. So this is a wonderful project, right? It brings people around a table, farmers and educators and teachers and NGO representatives, and together they make a map. But they don't just make it, they argue. No, that's a little bit to the west. They're not doing that kind of coffee there, they're doing this kind of coffee. And then these beans, my mother said that she was growing those beans over here too, so then you put a couple of beans over here. So what it becomes also is a conversation. It's an interface between different communities, and it's also then a representation of this place through food. Better, they take it out to events, and people stand around and say, oh, I didn't know that they were growing ginger over there. I used to be from the village next door, and we never had ginger. So then more stories continue. And someone else says, no, I grew up there, that is the wrong bean. You need to replace that bean with another bean. And so this map, becomes an opportunity for exchange and a continuing conversation. It's a food system visualization made out of food. And it's clearly pretty interesting for the people who see it. So from that way, I went that way. And we ended up organizing in Edinburgh, in collaboration with Queen Margaret University, the first ever symposium on gastronomy in Scotland. Charlotte Maberly, another alumna from the University of Gastronomic Sciences, and I were talking one day, and we thought, what if we did something like Unis in Edinburgh? I said, well, hey, I've got this project called Eco-Gastronomy. Let's see what we can do. And so as time evolved, we thought, yeah, we could do a thinking and making symposium. Usually academic symposia are pretty straightforward, people standing up doing what I'm doing right now, talking and showing slides. We wanted to do something with gastronomy that was more thinking, doing, feeling, more eco-gastronomic. And so we put together a 2-day event where making was on display as much as talking, where doing and thinking stood side by side and held equal value in the eyes of the community of people. What did we do? Well, a bunch of things. One of which was to have a panel of speakers open the conference with a keynote address, and right next to that panel of speakers, a master butcher was cutting up a hogget, which is a kind of lamb, a young lamb, or an old lamb, young sheep. And next to him was a man making bread, and next to him was a man cutting up vegetables. And the vegetables and the bread and the hogget all became the dinner that we had at the banquet that evening. Meanwhile, the writer and the activist and the shellfish fisherman and the academic talked about some of the ideas that we were going to then be sharing over the course of the symposium. Making, thinking, doing, talking. And what was extraordinary afterwards were a lot of people came up and said, David, I loved that opening session, but I didn't hear any of the words that were said because I was watching that master butcher do the incredible work with the hogget. Because indeed, his gestures were like a ballet. And so many people in the room came up afterwards and said, I'd forgotten how important butchery is. I'd forgotten that it isn't just a piece of meat in a styrofoam tray in plastic in the supermarket. It comes from an animal, and someone made sure that they cut it right to have it show up in my table. So even that simple gesture of showing the making aspect of a piece of meat became a really powerful introduction to this idea that food is thinking, doing, feeling, making all at once. The symposium went on and explored a few other themes that were difficult. In Scotland, there's an enormous amount of sugar consumed. There's a huge amount of very high-quality food produced as well, but a lot of it is for export. Smoked salmon and whiskey, some amazing products, some beautiful grain-based products. There's an ancient grain called barrameal. Delicious, nutty, crunchy, a little bit like oats, a little bit like barley, but not like either one of them. So these amazing foods are not being consumed as much by the Scottish people as they are by the international community that buys them for export. And then there's this huge amount of sugar and processed food that's eaten in Scotland. So this was a difficult question to confront. There's a very well-known now food in Scotland. It's called the Deepfried Mars Bar. And indeed, it's a Mars bar that is dipped in batter and then boiled in boiling oil, and it's eaten as a snack. And it's become an icon of the ridiculousness of the Scottish diet. Oh, those Scots, they all eat terrible food. Well, there was a woman who gave a presentation on the Deepfried Mars Bar, and we actually had a workshop on the Deepfried Mars Bar. We ate Deepfried Mars Bars. But at the same time, she told us about the history of how the Scots have historically been vilified, have been made to sound foolish by, largely, the English. There's a lot of tension between the English and the Scots. And one of the devices that has been used is the Deep-Fried Mars Bar. Another one is haggis. Haggis is a sort of pate-like food that's many internal organs ground up, mixed with oatmeal, and then cooked inside the stomach of the animal, the sheep. And haggis is delicious. It's a really lovely, complex, and very practical food. But it's also considered by some people to be a bit disgusting or low, not very elevated in terms of refinement. So things like haggis and deep-fried Mars bars become icons of not the actual food that is eaten, because in fact most Scots don't eat haggis or deep-fried Mars bars. A lot of visiting students to Edinburgh eat deep-fried Mars bars. A lot of tourists eat deep-fried Mars bars. The Scots themselves don't really eat deep-fried Mars bars that much. But it's become this complicated issue. And so we talked about it because we wanted it to be more known by more people as not actually real Scottish food, but a tool of criticism, a tool of making fun of a people, making fun of their food. At the same time, we had people presenting stories about crofting, about small-scale land holdings in the north of Scotland where very little grows, where life is incredibly difficult. But if you band together with other small-scale producers and create communities of crofting, you can actually have a pretty nice living. Scenery is gorgeous. The food is incredibly good for you because it's very unaffected by some of the environmental damage of other places. And so this was another story about what is true about Scotland and its food. In May and June, I then went to a number of places north of 50 degrees latitude in Europe. So we called it the North of 50 visit. And I went to Wrocław in Poland. I went to Oslo and Os in Norway, Copenhagen in Denmark, and Dublin in Ireland. And in each one of those places, different things happened. Wrocław is a fascinating city full of different foods, partly because it has been German, it's been Czechoslovakian, it's been Polish, certainly for some of its time. And so it occupies many different ethnicities, many different foods, many different styles of being. It's not typical of Poland, and yet it is also very typical of Poland. One of the places that I was taken by these food activists was to what are called a series of milk bars. And they're not actually just about milk and dairy. They're mostly about non-meat-based foods. They're food for the people, very inexpensive. We had bowls of cucumber soup, we had cheese blintzes, we had many different kinds of sauerkraut and coleslaw and cabbage salads. Very simple food, served extremely inexpensively and not in fancy china, but very hearty, very well made, primarily with local ingredients. So this is another form of subsidized food the government supports. But what's remarkable about the milk bars is that if you sit there for long enough, you will meet people from the very upper classes, from the working classes, you will meet homeless people, you will meet students, you will meet people from across society. And in general, we don't run into people from different classes in our day-to-day foodways. In our supermarkets, we tend to be in our neighborhoods and our communities, which tend to be relatively homogenous in terms of socioeconomic level. In our restaurants, the same thing. And so what's bizarre and wonderful about these milk bars is that they're crossing points of different communities. Yes, the food is affordable and cheap and delicious and very interesting, but it's also a way for different communities to connect. The next stop was to go to Oslo, and there I was hosted by some incredibly generous former students. Again, the network expands and expands. And one of the things that I learned, and I've learned over time, is how complex it is to maintain historic traditions of food eating. Norway is the only country in the European Union that's opted out of the anti-whaling pact. It's the only country where whaling still takes place. And there's one species of whale, the minke whale, that is hunted, and it's roughly 1,000 whales per year that are killed. They have very strict standards about the training of the whalers and the ways the whales can be killed. There's an exploding harpoon, a grenade harpoon that's used that about 85% of the time kills the whale within a few seconds. So that's a relatively good percentage on killing an animal. If you're going to kill animals, that's pretty good. However, it's a pretty violent way to kill an animal. However, if you think about the way that cows and chickens are killed, those are also pretty violent. I thought about this a long time because at a certain point in this visit, I was given the opportunity to eat some whale meat. Very generous gift from a fisher, from a whaler, who had captured the whale, slaughtered the whale, and then cured the whale's meat and brought along by the student of mine. And I said, of course I'm going to eat it. I'm going to taste it. I want to engage with the subject. I want to understand it better. I want to taste what it's like in my mouth and then feel what it's like in my body and then think what it's like in my mind. It wasn't quite simple, and many people have critiqued me since I've come back for doing this. But as I learned more about what it means to be a whaler, a practice that goes back perhaps a couple of millennia in that part of the world, and as I thought about my own culture in Montreal and Quebec, where we still do a great deal of sealing, and sealing is incredibly important to the indigenous communities of Quebec, I thought, I can understand how this is difficult. I can understand how this is important, and I can understand how I don't really understand it well enough to take a position on what it is. So I tell this story because I like to bear witness to the fact that whaling takes place, that I've consumed whale meat. There's many questions that need to be thought about and felt about, and there's no one certainty about what whale meat is. On the other hand, right next to it on that plate was some smoked reindeer hearts. Reindeer hearts that had been gifted to my friend by some Sami reindeer herders, Sami, who are the northern people of Scandinavia, who do continue to practice herding and eating reindeer. My friend and former student, Anaseri, had taken those reindeer hearts from her friends and had put them in a smoker in her backyard in downtown Oslo. And so we ate some smoked reindeer hearts together. We also ate this remarkable thing, which is a seagull egg that is foraged, that is then cooked for 4 minutes and served with a wild leek vinaigrette and some asparagus, at least in my case. The thing about seagull eggs, apparently, is you have to always leave one in the nest, because if you take all the seagull eggs, the seagull will stop laying. If you leave one, the seagull will continue to lay her eggs. In Copenhagen, we organized another roundtable. In this case, it was about figuring out how we could think in Denmark more about good in terms of food. Right now, there's about a 90% penetration into the consumer market of the red Ø, which is the organic label that's most successful in Denmark. It's incredibly popular. People believe in organics. But organic seems to be a kind of glass ceiling where stories stop being told. There's not a lot about biodiversity. There's not a lot about localness. There's not a lot about wild food. There's not a lot about biodynamics. And so some of these other questions about what could be good, what could be personal, what could be positive, have not been circulating. So we organized this panel, and we had about, 35 people come and question and say, yeah, but what about environmental degradation? Yes, organic is good, but it's not the only good. And so again, lots of questions got raised, and mostly people left with a wondering. And I sometimes think that's useful. This is one of the things about storytelling, is it doesn't close down, it doesn't give answers, it doesn't come to a conclusion. It usually raises more questions, and hopefully those questions linger in the bodies and the minds of the people who were listening to the stories, and then they go and do something with it afterwards, and activate new questions for more people. Just as a side note, the student Maya Hay, she is another former student at the University of Gastronomic Sciences, and she's now in Montreal doing her PhD in fermentation, political theory, dance, and communications. That's what gastronomy is, if you ask me. I got to Ireland, and I was participating in the Dublin Gastronomy Symposium there, and one of my favorite things to do, and it may not seem very slow food of me, but I love going to supermarkets and places like Marks and Spencer's in the UK, and buying and eating all the local food products that are packaged and weird and crunchy and full of processed ingredients, and just tasting the experience of that. I also like eating some somewhat more healthful food, but on the first night, it's nice to eat some potato chips and have a beer and see what else. So I went to the Marks and Spencer's and I bought some Welsh cakes and this fragrant and spicy Bombay mix, which turns out to be corn crackers with a lot of sugar and chili on them. Some cheese and red onion flavored potato chips. And this bottle, this curious bottle of what's called Puchin, which is basically, well, if you're familiar with the American words, it's moonshine. It's homemade distilled spirits which is now being rediscovered in Ireland. And indeed, at the symposium, there was an academic paper given on the history of poitín and its importance in food culture in Ireland. So I tasted the poitín. It was interesting. It was a bit like grappa, of a not very fruity variety. It's basically anything you can find in your house that you can distill into alcohol. So it could be grain, potatoes, sugar, fruit. And this was the version I tried, which is, as you can see, in a very hip, contemporary designed bottle. So this old tradition that's being remembered in a new way is being brought forward into the local market. I'm not sure it was the best thing to pair with spicy Bombay mix and Welsh cakes, but that's something we learn as we go. And at the same time, I had some extraordinary local strawberries and some delicious Irish cream and some amazing cheeses, and learned about this thing, which is a noggin. And a noggin is a drinking vessel. That handle you hold with your thumb. It's a bit like holding a water bottle like this, and you eat with it or you drink with it. It's used for drinking out of a communal pot of milk. It's used for pouring soup into. And when the Irish immigrants came to North America, many of them brought their noggins with them, and you can see in old photographs and in old paintings this noggin that would have been carried. It was your personal way of eating, and you carried it with you everywhere because you never knew when you were going to have access to food, and you wouldn't be able to carry a bowl and a cup and a spoon and a plate and a knife and a napkin. So you would carry your noggin, and it would just go with you, and it was your constant companion. The second to last stop I made was in Toronto, and I just want to share this because this is showing, I think, an example of how simple eco-gastronomy can be. I went to the Ontario College of Art and Design, and it's now a university, so they call it OCAD-U. And there, I was talking with students who worked mostly in design. Many of them were master students, or they were upper-level undergraduate students working on their final projects. So we organized a 1-hour lunchtime break, and it was also a workshop on gastronomy. And I told them about the famous Vietnamese sandwich, the banh mi, which is a hybrid. It's a hybrid of French and Southeast Asian foods, of different cultures, of street food, of fancy food, of simple food. And I proposed to them to make their own version of a hybrid banh mi sandwich with a lot of ingredients that I had brought. What do you mean? I said, well, think about what's your challenges right now with your studies. Think about where you're stuck. Thinking about the questions, the places that you don't know how to get past in what you want to explain with your writing or with your design. What's at the center of that challenge? What's the conundrum that you're facing? Now make a sandwich that represents that conundrum. And I watched them. Some of them stood back and looked at the ingredients, made notes. Some of them dived in, started making things. Some of them were tasting before they made because they didn't know some of the ingredients that I brought. I brought a lot of weird stuff, pickles and kimchi and not weird, but things that were maybe not familiar to them. Different kinds of meats, not the traditional banh mi ingredients. So I presented them with some challenge. And so they made, and they tasted, and they took pictures. And then afterwards we had a little debrief. So they made sandwiches for 15 minutes. We talked for 15 minutes. We hung out for 15 minutes, and then they went home. Some of them theorized their complexity problem, theorized their sandwich, made their sandwich, had an analysis. Some of them clearly had just made a sandwich, and when I asked them what was the rationale for that sandwich, they made it up on the spot. That's also sometimes part of design and part of gastronomy. Sometimes the material comes first, and then you figure out what it means. Sometimes the meaning comes first, and then you make a material object. Sometimes they happen simultaneously, and that's also gastronomy, because it's all one thing. So at the end of this day, I had the colleague who I organized this with said, people were coming up to me all afternoon saying, I figured out how to do my writing. I figured out what my thesis is about. I solved my problem. I thought, oh yes, look what food can do. Look what making a sandwich can do. And just most recently, I was in Quito with Estefania Baldeon, who's here in the front row as well. We just saw each other a week ago in a very different place. And we were organizing an event about traditional beverages in Ecuador. Right now, there's a new tax that has been introduced by the federal government that puts a very heavy position on sugary beverages and alcoholic beverages. And as we were talking amongst the four of us, there were actually 4 students from the university from Ecuador who collaborated on this project. And as we were talking about this idea, we thought, well, what if we did an event that focused on traditional beverages, beverages that aren't industrial? What if we thought about all the things that we have to drink here that might not be taxed? What if we just thought about beverages as a category and had people talk about their history and their production and their tasting and all of the different ways that beverages exist in Ecuador? So we did that. And I had a couple of days walking up and down the very steep hills of Quito where I got quite out of breath and rather dehydrated. And I explored some of the local packaging, this red, yellow, and green called a semáforo, like a street light, indicating the levels of salt, fat, and sugar in each one of these packaged ingredients, something new that I had not seen, but I thought, oh, that's an interesting way of representing this food. I had some interesting local foods, a pork sandwich, some ceviche, of course, served with, what else? Popcorn. That's the appropriate way to eat it. I met up with this man who makes what are called colaciones, which are peanuts covered in a sugar syrup and then shaken over a coal brazier for 3 hours while you're wearing a Che Guevara t-shirt. That's an important part of the recipe. But he works there over this heat with this heavy pot, 3 hours, adding the sugar syrup and shaking. And at the end, he's made maybe 1 kilo of peanuts. And I thought, that is extraordinary dedication. This production has been taking place at almost the same location for 101 years. And that's his workshop. Very simple and very interesting, unusual, very sweet, and the peanut almost dissolves into the sugar. We held the event. Now, part of my purpose with this particular event was to see how we could have an eco-gastronomy project event where I was as unpresent as possible, where the students, where the alumni became the leaders much more than me. I'm called the director of the project. I would like to not be the project director. I would like to be an advisor or a mentor. In fact, one of our other colleagues called me the mentor of the Eco-Gastronomy project, and it turned on a light in my head saying, what if David was not the one moving around? What if our alumni and their colleagues and their projects become the leaders of the Eco-Gastronomy project? And so in many ways, during our interactions, I was trying not to make decisions, and I was trying to help others make the decisions that were more appropriate. Decisions I couldn't make because I wasn't from the place and I didn't know the issues as well as they did. Why would I make those decisions? And Estefania became, I think, an extraordinary project director for this event, as did her colleagues. And then the miracle, it got taken to its nth degree because the night of the event, I was in fact extremely sick and couldn't participate. I got to say hello to the speakers and then I had to go home to bed because I was very unwell. I disappeared. The project happened brilliantly. Everyone was talking about what a success it was. The speakers enjoyed it, the audience enjoyed it, and I think the organizers of the event enjoyed it. And so in some ways, this represented a beautiful evolution of what I think could happen with the Eco-Gastronomy project, which is to have it be a true network of knowledge exchange and creation by local leaders, probably by UNISG alumni who already understand the idea of thinking, doing, and feeling food and its transformative power. It doesn't need to have a leader because all of us, all of them, are already the leaders of what is becoming eco-gastronomy in the world.